Welcome everybody to the first of several webinars on an exciting topic, which is esports. And this webinar is going to be focusing on the people aspect of esports, those who are involved in playing, in managing, and all other aspects that really just involve the people involved. And other future webinars may explore some other topics, but that's what we're going to be doing today. My name is Jeremy Mittman, and I'm a partner at SK in Los Angeles, where I practice exclusively in labor and employment matters and represent employers across a variety of industries with a focus on entertainment, helping in terms of advice and counseling issues and also litigation when such becomes necessary. And we're lucky enough to be joined today by two other speakers. Our first is Andrew Cooke, who is in the UK and joining us from the UK, who is the general counsel of Fnatic, which is a fantastic esports company, which you'll find a little bit more about in a moment. And also by Jackie Granet, who is one of my colleagues in our immigration department. And Jackie will be focusing in particular on immigration topics affecting esports. So let me actually ask Andrew if you could please introduce yourself to the audience.
Well, hello, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be joining MSK today. Particularly for this first session, I feel particularly honored to be kicking off this series. As Jeremy mentioned, I'm general counsel at Fnatic. Who's Fnatic, or who are Fnatic? We are the world's leading esports team. I say leading, that probably needs a bit of qualification, seeing as there will be some lawyers on this call. I mean leading across two metrics in particular. So as an esports team, we play multiple teams in multiple games. So we're not a developer, we don't develop the games. We run teams of players. So this is a little bit like, for those of you who follow soccer, Barcelona, their model. They have a basketball team, a handball team, and of course their famous football team. All those teams play in the same colors. Some of them share sponsors, and they all play under the same umbrella. So in this analogy, we are Barcelona. We sit across the top of teams playing in multiple titles. My background, and the second level on which we are leading is that we are the world's most watched esports team this year. And as we'll come on to talk about, one of the incredible growth areas for esports during the course this year has been watched hours. That's generally on streaming platforms like Twitch. But this is just attention, if you like. It's a proxy for attention. And in the world of influencers and sort of online celebrities, obviously eyeballs are king. And again, we'll also be talking about that in the immigration context. So Fnatic, a very heavily watched esports team. My background is also in music and sport and entertainment. I was general counsel at one of the world's biggest promoters for the best part of the decade. And I moved into esports about 18 months ago because Nostradamus-like, I looked into my crystal ball, saw there was going to be a global pandemic, that the music and sports events would be taken entirely online, and I thought that's the place to be. If only that was the case, sadly not. But
you couldn't
yes,
have born that.
That's right. That's right. I foresee great things for this seminar, Jackie. That's the key thing. But yeah, I think there are some really interesting parallels to draw out of that journey, and also what's happened in the last 6 months, both in sport and esport, and what that tells us for future trends. And I'm sure we'll be exploring some of that during the chat today.
Fantastic, and thanks for that intro and background. Jackie, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name is Jackie Granet, and I am an associate at MSK. I've been at MSK for about 4 years, and I practiced for about 4 years previously in New York. There are visa categories for basically every letter of the alphabet, and they cross over all industries, but I would say that I specialize in entertainment and fashion and the arts. And something I've been doing a lot of more recently is sort of new media emerging industries, which includes a lot of social media influencers, YouTubers, esports players, and commentators, announcers. And the three of us spoke a little bit earlier this week, and I said, all of these industries are now making me question all my life choices because they seem a lot more fun and they're a lot more lucrative. But it's very exciting to sort of be on the forefront of a new market and trying to explain why this is important, why this person would benefit the US, why they should be able to come here. That's it.
So along the lines of what Jackie was saying about how exciting and everyone is talking about esports right now, it's really quite common and on the tip of everyone's tongue. Perhaps, Andrew, this would be as good of a time as any for perhaps you could give us a little bit of background about how popular esports is right now and its tremendous growth, and then perhaps talk a little bit about what some of the issues you see facing the industry are right now, especially in light of COVID.
Yeah, good question. So it's almost become a little bit of a cliche to talk about how much esports is growing and so on. And I'm aware that this talk may be viewed by people who really understand the space and people who are perhaps just sort of interested bystanders without a particular let's say investment interest or personal interest in it, just interested in a hot area of sort of new business. So I'll try to cover an explanation which caters to both of those groups. It is definitely true that esports is growing, and it is definitely true that it is increasingly valuable just as a kind of like a business space. So there's an esports data site called Newzoo, which is a kind of the home of esports stats in this kind of area, so just general statistics. And they issue a report each year that talks about how much the industry as a whole is worth. And that's basically just it's Everest in terms of growth in recent, across the last 5 years. If I just summarize that period, within like 15, 16, very early sort of seed capital started to coalesce around esports, and some initial bets were placed. And at that time, there was we were still in what I've described before as the Motown era for esports. So this is where young people are, because it generally is young people, are just happy to be playing games and will, probably not legally advised, almost certainly with no agent. So we're just happy to receive a relatively small amount of money for the privilege of going on a stage and playing games. And contracts were signed during that time, and we're going to talk about one of those in particular as a recent example, that were generally speaking quite organization favorable and not particularly talent favorable. And actually we look back at those contracts now with our kind of like modern understanding of how much those individuals are worth. But at the time, this genuinely was a very risky space, and it continues to be to a certain extent a risky space from a maturity perspective. And again, we'll talk a little bit about what that means for advisors or people who are potentially looking to invest in this space in practice. But yeah, so in that initial period, lots of seed capital, lots of bets being placed. Some of those organizations have gone on to great things, some less so. Moving forward a couple of years later, you see the absolute explosion in what are called FPS games, first-person shooters. So this was driven in major part by Fortnite, which is an absolute juggernaut, not necessarily in esports, but in gaming more generally. Fortnite was one of the first games to really gain super crossover appeal. So it wasn't just of interest to gamers, it became part of the cultural consciousness. And of course, Epic Games, which is the developer of Fortnite, has done a tremendous job at maturing that property. So it's no longer just the game that's played by kids on consoles, it's played on mobile, and is now increasingly become a social network, right? So this is not just a place where people get to meet and hang out. So what in traditional sort of parlance was called the third space. So your first space at home, second space is at work, and then you have a third space to play. Not just a social network, but also increasingly a place where entertainment content is launched, which is a kind of entertainment arcade, if you like, in sort of boomerish language, where kids are going not just to meet their friends, not just for entertainment experience, but to experience movies, to experience particular types of entertainment content, all those kind of things. So this spawns figurines and all this kind of thing, and becomes an intellectual property sort of behemoth in its own right. So all of that happened, and that then also attracted more interest. And again, if I look at the most recent period, we talked earlier on about eyeballs, but this is the period when eyeballs really did become the currency. So all those young gamers that were engaged during that seed period suddenly crossed over from the world of gaming into the world of influence, and we're starting to sort of hold behind them gigantic audiences. I mean, I'm talking tens of millions of subscribers on social, incredible reach, the kind of reach that even major celebrities like a kind of a Beyonce or Rihanna would be comparable to, individuals as brands and content generators. So the Motown era ends again with this case we're going to talk about in a minute, and we are now in a whole new sort of area for esports, and this really coincided with the start of lockdown. So you saw a couple of trends happening. You saw this recognition of the true value of individuals within esports, which manifested in a couple of issues. You saw the breakthrough impact of gaming into the mainstream, and all these things were already existing at the start of COVID. But of course, when sports and entertainment content started to fall out of the calendar, as those organizations began to, in your space, MLB, NFL, NBA, started to work out how they were going to complete or start or carry out regular seasons within the shadow of COVID. Of course, the esports, which is inherently digital, was just ready to go and ready to take that audience on. So we saw in the start of this year, Q1, Twitch, 3 billion watched hours. Q2, Twitch, 5 billion watch hours. Q3, Twitch, a little drop, but to 4.7 billion watch hours. So we're seeing some consistency in the amount of people who are just watching games. If I talk about the people who have watched somebody play games or play games themselves in the US now, this is 80% of the adult population is either playing games or watching someone play games. So they're very games adjacent. The esports audience is just growing and growing, and the proportion of that which would describe themselves as esports enthusiasts, is also growing year on year. So if I think about our addressable market, right, this has gone from being a relatively small audience at the start of that period I described earlier on, the real enthusiasts, to now, not just PC gamers, not just console gamers, but gamers who are playing on mobile, increasingly gamers who are playing on cloud. Everybody now is a gamer. It's not really about whether or not you play games. I'm talking about the kind of Candy Crush end of the spectrum. It's really about how much you play games, the extent to which you play games with your friends, the extent to which you take your gaming seriously, and so on. That's where we're kind of at with the ecosystem right now. So we talked about players recognizing their true value. What that means in practice is, I'm not fully across average player salaries in NFL, NBA, and NHL at the moment, those kind of sports, but I am pretty familiar with how much people get played in soccer in Europe. And because several esports teams are now listed, we can sort of say with confidence where the market is at in terms of spend on players' salaries. And we know from that, for example, that an organization playing one of the tier 1 titles, so we would consider tier 1 titles to be titles like League of Legends, which is developed by Riot, and Counter-Strike, which is developed by Valve. Tier 1 titles like that, although there are others, I should be clear, players in those kind of games are now earning the same amount of money as a sort of a tier 2 footballer in the top leagues in Europe, the Premier League notwithstanding. Of course, the revenues of those organizations are not top tier sports team revenues. There's a bit of a sort of like a irreconcilable difference there. I would say if one thing that we've really learned over the last 6 months is the assumption that was going into a lot of esports modeling, which was that basically the more people who are watching you, the better your organization will perform on a revenue level. So a linear correlation, if you like, that has been disproven. Because although we've been very good at retaining and converting new sponsors who are kind of interested in this space for lots of reasons, right? You could say because there was no other sports content available, viewership was attracted to esports, and obviously that assists in sponsor conversations, but also smart sponsors were also starting to understand the power of esports to convert sort of young potential consumers who, generally speaking, don't watch TV. When they surf online, they're using an ad blocker. don't watch newspapers, so don't read newspapers and so on. They're a very difficult audience to attract, but they're a very attractive audience. Smart sponsors had already started to engage with esports to connect with those kinds of people. So where are we now? Well, again, in a super interesting space. I think all those things that I mentioned that had happened before COVID sort of teed us up for a very interesting time here. Now, of course, nothing is good about COVID. I want to be completely clear about that. I mean, nobody is enjoying the circumstances that we're in now, but we can't deny that for digital content, like the digital content that we as an organization put out, it's been a fantastic time for viewers of that content because it's driven competition in that space. It's been a great thing for the players because the players are starting to recognize their true value. It's been a great thing for proactive sponsors because those sponsors have seen the value of the seed investments that they placed really come off. Yeah, it's been great for the teams whose brands ultimately are now connecting with that greater audience that I mentioned when I did my funnel hands earlier on. That greater audience now is connected into this. So many more people are adjacent to what it is that we do. That's a great opportunity for us. So I hope that wasn't sort of too much of a sprint through. A lot has been happening in the last 6 months. But yeah, a really, really interesting time to be in anything digital, but particularly something like this, which is so social and so kind of youth oriented. And again, touches on some of those wonderful things that Jackie talked about earlier on when she talks about the growth in influencers and this emerging class of young entertainers that is going to take over the world in the coming sort of, well, I was going to say coming years, but it could even be the coming months, particularly if we have a second wave.
Fantastic. Wow. Well, thanks for that background, Andy. Really appreciate that. And along the lines of these social influencers and people who are kind of well known, I think one of those people, and Andy, I think you alluded to the dispute perhaps regarding him, and this is as good as any area to kind of just jump into what some of the employment, labor and employment issues can be with respect to esports. Is back in a long time ago in esports world, which was 2018, there was a lawsuit brought by one of the most popular athletes by the name of Turner Tenney, which some folks may know as Tfue, and this was versus FaZe Clan, very popular esports company. And basically in 2018, Mr. Tenney filed a lawsuit against the company in California, basically claiming that the contract that he was under was generally oppressive and unfair, and that he was taken advantage of as a young individual just entering the space, kind of what Andy was alluding to, which was happening, I think, back in the day more, before things got very popular. And he basically claimed that under the contract that the company was able to take up to 80% of his earnings. And the case was actually eventually moved to New York. And an interesting part of it, by the way, is that one of the things that Mr. Tenney was claiming was that there was a violation of California Business and Professions Code 16600, which is just also known as the non-compete law. And basically he said that he was subject to an unfair non-compete because he pointed to the fact that he couldn't really engage in any other type of competitive activity during the term of his contract. Interestingly, what the company said in response was, and the judge actually agreed with him because this issue was decided by a judge, was that in fact he was not a employee as he perhaps tried to maintain, but rather the contract specified that he was an independent contractor. And for purposes of being a contractor, although generally speaking you can bind an employee to exclusive activity during the term of a contract, because it was a contractor, contractors should have the ability to engage in other competitive activity. And so the court found that there should be an avenue to pursue that. The case, however, was settled just a few months ago. in the summer of 2020, with both sides making statements of an amicable nature and mentioning that the matter was resolved. We don't know how much money changed hands, but I think that we can assume that some did. Before I go on to talk about some other issues, Andy, just wanted to see if you had any comments about that lawsuit and kind of from your perspective in the esports world, if that made any waves, and if so, if you thought there were any consequences as a result.
I think there was a couple of layers to it, I guess. So there was the kind of prurient interest kind of thing where everybody, and you saw this in terms of let's say general commentary on this in the US press in particular tended to focus around the question of, at least to the extent that I looked at that, tended to focus on, sorry, there's a guy that gets paid to play games, or he earns how much from endorsements, right? Because I think there's still a kind of a, I mean, look, I because of my sort of former work in sport and so on, I quite often find myself in environments where, for example, there might be a conference around sport, and they want to tack on esports at the side, and there's often a very kind of big brother, little brother kind of vibe to some of those kind of things. So, okay, esports is here. Okay, how about you guys you just sit over there on the kids' table, and you learn from the adults where you can. I think that kind of dismissiveness around what's happening within the world of entertainment generally, which again, Jackie touched on. We talked we were sort of like prepping for this about some of the relative youth of some of these influencers, and that creating a mainstream culture of dismissiveness of the level of influence and the level of just engagement and volume young influencers are starting to move, and what that means for the culture, and specifically what that means for senior CMOs and those kind of people who sometimes may not be digital natives themselves. I mean, I'm although you may not be able to tell from my extremely youthful complexion and looks, I'm 41, and I'm comfortably the oldest person in Fnatic. So the extent to which I engage with a young audience and understand these kind of things, like I have to bring my humbleness myself. So when I see that kind of level of commentary on this case particularly, right, I recognize my own limitations in terms of addressing these kind of issues. And one of the reasons why I like to talk to folks like you is to be able to uptick everyone's understanding of where all of this is going. So there's that kind of general initial observation. I think as to the lawsuit, I by no means do I wish litigation upon anybody. It's as a former litigator myself, I think it's generally speaking has terrible outcomes even for the winners. But it would have been interesting to see that case brought all the way through to a decision, because it could have potentially resolved a couple of interesting issues around status. And obviously we've kind of got, Grubhub over in the US, and you have DPD, Uber, and similar kind of organizations over here in EU and UK, where these issues of employee versus independent contractor are being discussed. There was multiple issues within that trial. There was sort of like the nerdy forum and jurisdiction issue. There was also some questions around the status of FaZe as an agency and how it interacts with talent and represents and holds their IP. Again, all of those things would have been interesting to see resolved, but I'm pleased that it was satisfactorily resolved for both of those parties. I think what we haven't really seen yet is any courts out with that particular bit of litigation really tackle esports issues and sort of grapple with some of the issues that come out of that, again, which we'll talk about in a moment. Until that happens, we're still going to see people doing things like take their contract disputes to Twitter, basically. I mean, again, when we're thinking about, so one of the factors there, which you mentioned in the Tifu litigation, was that ultimately that contract comes out and it effectively gets litigated by the fan community, right? So he's in a position to be able to, he wasn't in a position in, 2015 or whenever it was that he signed that agreement to bring his clout to bear. But we've certainly seen this in football. I think there's been some of this in the NFL as well. Players will now turn to fan bases and say, what do you think of these contract terms that I'm bound to? Do you think this is reasonable? Maybe you should use this hashtag free X from their terrible contract. And how about you tag in the team and the team owner as well whilst you're at it? We're seeing that kind of thing happen, and that thing is regularly happening within esports. So again, an interesting maturity issue. These things are not getting litigated in the courts. Inevitably, digital native people take their digitally native disputes to a digital environment to get them resolved, and that element of it sort of didn't fully play out in relation to the Tfue piece because he's had enough money eventually to get the right advisors on board. But yeah, that's still happening, and that's interesting for organisations like ours who are putting forward this paperwork. I think a really interesting challenge for lawyers generally is, okay, it's always a challenge to make our paperwork fully understood. Our sort of drafting view, if you like, is we always try and draft in plain language, or we always try and make things explicable. But one of our responses to the Tfue dispute was, it's not enough to make your contract obviously legally robust, obviously commercially robust, but easy to read. You're going to have to put some, major disclaimers on the front of this around, you need to verify to us that you've taken tax advice. You need to verify to us that you've taken legal advice before you sign this agreement. And particularly if obviously there are some additional layers of protection for minors and underage people. But we became much more conscious of, let's say, the look and feel of our contracts and the explicability of our contracts, and ensuring that everybody is completely clear before they go in terms of what it is that they sign. And if one of our contracts was to find its way on social media, which let's all hope doesn't happen. But if it was to happen, then the community would not look at it and go, well, yes, obviously that's number one, just a complete thicket of legalese. And number two, there's no evidence of kind of good faith on the part of the organization in terms of how they're approaching young talent and how they're wrapping up the various rights that are being exchanged between those two parties. I think as a general sort of piece of advice, I think that's a good thing for anybody advising, young people, to make sure that they get that advice when they need it.
Well, and given how lucrative some of these contracts are, hopefully they are getting the legal advice that they need in order to fully create what they're going to be signing. But regardless of what anybody signs, I think another important issue that's going to, I know it's already started percolating on the forefront, but I think one of those issues as the industry matures more is going to be harassment and discrimination issues. Maybe thinking back, just broad terms in terms of what the composition is, sometimes I think that there's a perception that there may be a lack of diversity in esports. Certainly, there's some stats I've seen that 50% of fans are minorities, but that might not necessarily be reflected in the players. And certainly, I believe it's the case that approximately 70% of esports athletes are male, but there's certainly a significant portion of the fan base that's female. And I believe close to 50%, in fact. Although, Andy, do you have any further statistics on that?
Yeah, I think you have it broadly right. I think there's if you look again, so thinking about that total addressable market, because of the number of mobile gaming democratizes gaming and esports, right? So because so many people have, let's say, the number of people who can afford a full gaming rig is relatively small at the global level. The number of people who can afford a console is relatively small at the global level, but mobile phone penetration now is beyond a sort of tipping point. So if we think about all the people who have a gaming device in their pocket now, even from 5 years ago, obviously it's substantially more. So that if we construe gamers at that level, and we think about all the people that play games at that level, then that is very broadly gender split, and it's also because of that democratizing effect, so it becomes cheaper to play esports. That also opens up emerging markets, which generally speaking tend to involve non-white people. So that also increases the pool of, or let's say the diversity of gamers as a whole. To your point, it's a difficult question to answer in the sense of, at the top line, I want to make clear that esports has to become more diverse, right? So this is again a very similar conversation around traditional sports. Obviously, you have things like the Rooney Rule in NFL, right? How you ensure that people see people of non-white backgrounds see other people of non-white backgrounds succeeding in that sport and getting ahead, and that creates a sense of a pathway for their own success. Obviously, it's more complicated than that as an issue. But that's something that esports needs to embrace, and I think we as an organisation, particularly in response to issues like Black Lives Matter that came up over the course of the summer, if you like, had to take a hard look at ourselves in terms of what it was that we were doing in that space, and the reality is that we need to do more. So rather than kind of go long on the steps that we're taking, we're preferring to try and get our own house in order. So start to collect our own diversity statistics, start to identify individual actions in terms of unconscious bias and those kind of things that enable us to change as an organization and recognize our failings in that regard and address them. But I would also say that construing esports only in terms of what's happening in the US is to ignore the wider diversity of the market as a whole. So as an organization, Fnatic, I'm speaking to you from London today, but we also have offices in LA, but also in Mumbai and in Berlin and in Tokyo and in Malaysia. And in these places, obviously you're not seeing white people play games, so to speak. Our Indian team, for example, is all Indian nationals, which introduces another challenge for us on a diversity level. And I would say it also introduces a challenge for Western-based teams on a diversity level as well, because what are, let's say, moral norms, the perspectives that players in those organizations bring, and their moral values, which, to give you a simple example, if we sign a team in India and we have a Muslim player in that team and one of our team sponsors is a gambling company, then of course that will offend the moral values of that person. And we've had that issue. We've addressed that issue as an organization. Equally, there are issues of let's say what you might call First Amendment rights issues coming up out of specific countries as esports expands into those spaces. And so that also raises interesting questions for global organizations that I guess are broadly D&I related. So I prefer to look at that as, if esports wasn't as big as it is, and it wasn't as global as it is, and it wasn't as trans-border and sort of digitally native as it is, then we wouldn't be having these issues. So the question for us in esports is to say, do we try and pretend like those issues don't exist and sort of go, oh, well, actually that's not anything about gaming and we don't have to address that? Or do we say, okay, we're sort of big and ugly enough now and mature enough, to that point earlier on about maturity, we're mature enough to address these kind of things and tackle them. And again, as an organization, I think we recognize that we need to do more. And I would rather talk, let's say, about some of the specific things that we do when I'm confident that we've reached that level of maturity.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to see that you're taking that all into account and leading the charge front. Certainly seems that way. I do think that it's important, just taking a step back, that that esports companies understand that. I think in the news, what we've seen is some inappropriate comments made by some athletes towards, for example, reporters, to fans. But I think that the greatest amount of potential liability in this area would be, for example, a player harassing another player or something like that. And so I think it's important to recognize that it's incredibly helpful and needed to have strong anti-harassment and non-discrimination policies and procedures in place for when those issues may arise, as well as having, I think, strong reporting mechanisms so that players understand how they can seek redress and raise a concern, how it's going to be investigated, how it's going to be resolved, and then making sure that if there are issues that arise, that prompt and thorough remedial action is taken. I think that's all the more important if you consider, for example, in the US, a company is going to be liable for the act of harassment from one employee to another if the company knew or should have known of the harassment and failed to do anything about it and prevent it. And by the way, if you have a supervisor or a manager, the test is even stronger because then the company is going to be liable no matter what. Basically, it's just a strict liability. And the analysis is, did the supervisor do it? If so, company is going to be liable for those acts. So I think that's all the more important to have robust training and policies and procedures in place.
I was just going to say I completely agree with all those things, and I think there's an additional dynamic that we touched on earlier on, which is not everybody who falls into these policies is going to be an employee. There's going to be an independent contractor. So how you spread that kind of policy across the organization without having that as an additional layer in the rebuttable presumption on whether or not somebody is an employee is also an interesting dynamic. Like, you need to ensure that ultimately those harassment policies and so on are going to be addressed effectively, that you do that in a way that doesn't create problems in other areas. So you're pushing it all the way across your supplier base, and those whistleblower and other types of activities are communicated universally rather than just within your sort of pro gaming unit. The other area here as well, in terms of harassment, which we can touch on, but I wanted to raise because it's something that we are really focusing on heavily at the moment, is safeguarding. So areas where you have minors on deck or at-risk persons. My understanding within that space is we're moving away from terms like vulnerable people into people who are at risk, recognizing that both adults and children can be at risk for safeguarding. Historically, let's say if you had, some of the issues that gymnastics has had, for example, where you have a coach and a power misbalance and exploitation that results, that is still happening within a physical environment, which is structurally easier to contain through controls. If you're in a digital environment, that same power dynamic exists. In fact, if anything, in the world of where clout is so important, it's been exacerbated, because it is literally possible for some of these organizations to make somebody famous overnight. That power dynamic is there, and how that is dealt with in a digital environment, it requires an additional layer of thought and consideration and likely advice beyond even just your sort of straight up organizational harassment policies.
Fantastic point. And by the way, I'll just mention on the subject of minors, this is a unique industry where it very well may be the case that players are, for example, under 18 under some circumstances, and so that raises certainly a host of legal and compliance issues. Certainly, I mean, one of those is, for example, just the capacity of the minor to contract and enter into a contract. In California, it's interesting because there's such a large entertainment presence. There's all sorts of procedures in place where you can go get a contract affirmed by a court and found to be in the best interest of the minor, and therefore the minor is bound to the contract, which is really only available for certain types of contracts, including entertainment and sports contracts. So, but nonetheless, even so, there may be some restrictions that are not applicable to adults who are going to be performing. So, for example, if you are even just 17 years old in California, you're generally limited to only working 4 hours a day on weekdays and during certain prescribed periods of time, which may not necessarily jive with a team schedule. So there's all sorts of interesting issues that could arise in that case. Let me just mention one other interesting issue, which is an ADA issue, and by that I mean Americans with Disabilities Act type issue. And that is, interestingly, I think we've seen a rise of some teams or some players trying to use, like in any sport, trying to get an advantage, and the use of performance enhancing drugs or PEDs. And back a few years ago, there was a controversial interview that one player gave where he basically just stated that the entire team was on Adderall and using Adderall to win in a competition. And so what you have then, I think, as an outgrowth was the ESL, or Electronic Sports League, basically, which I believe Fnatic is a member of, coming up with a list of banned substances, which include illegal drugs, like one would think of, for example, cocaine, marijuana, but also Adderall or Ritalin and those types of drugs, which could provide, certainly as one can understand, an enhanced performance. But what needs to be balanced, though, is that certainly some individuals could have diagnosed disorders, for example, ADHD or ADD, that require the use of these performance-enhancing drugs. So there's, I think, a balance that needs to be made in terms of permitting those with what would consider to be, at least under U.S. law, disabilities, and then on the other hand, performance-enhancing drugs that are prohibited. So that's kind of an interesting tension.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're on that for the purposes of, if I look at how cycling dealt with that or didn't deal with it, if you like, and initially anyway, and is unfortunately now sort of forever hard with the brush, and how the UFC actually, when it pursued legitimacy, right, when the new owners took over and ultimately started the early path towards their spectacular exit a few years ago. One of the things they did was anyway run towards regulation, and within esports, you're talking about ESL is moves in there. You're correct. We are very close friends with ESL, and we play in several of their leagues, and have been working with them recently on regulations around a new league structure. During the course of those discussions around the sort of governance paperwork on that, a player in another team posted on his Instagram channel advice, pretty much a sort of like a how-to on steroid use. Now, having gigantic guns or whatever is not necessarily performance enhancing within esports, and so steroids weren't on the ban list. But of course, the answer is they should be on the ban list, because when people think of integrity issues in esports, they commonly think about things like match fixing, which in some areas of the world is unfortunately still occurring. And although I should emphasize, not on our watch, and the exact issue that you raise, which is using stimulants to enhance concentration or sort of awareness, response times and things during games. And you can see how obviously they would be beneficial to gamers. Those are the kind of things they think of when they talk about integrity. I disagree that those are the key integrity issues, because actually under most of the governance laws, they are cut and dry issues. If you are found to be cheating in those kind of ways, then you're out, and it's very difficult for you to get back in. But nevertheless, there's also the sort of visual, reputational component of those kind of things. And ultimately, if we're accepting players showing people how to use steroids on Instagram, then we are not doing a very effective job at setting an ethical tone for esports. And as I mentioned earlier on, so when we talked about diversity and inclusion, so much of our maturity sort of journey requires us to embrace and tackle these things, which some people within esports would still much rather not talk about, and definitely drug use is one of those.
Well, that's very well said. Thanks, Andy. And we have so many things to talk about, so many topics that we even haven't delved into. But I would like to shift to some immigration-related issues, so that Jackie can provide a little bit of insight about her work and how it implicates esports issues.
Sure. I'll be the first to say, at the beginning of the journey that I've taken with new media and gaming, I didn't quite understand what was happening. This is coming from someone who probably last played Super Nintendo, only has like Sudoku and the New York Times crossword puzzle on my phone. It was just not something I was aware of. And then I started to think about it, and I played basketball my whole life through high school. And I just watched the NBA finals, and there's really no difference between that and playing a video game and watching someone play a video game, or playing chess and watching a chess tournament. So it all came together at some point, but I definitely was a little bit taken aback by how big of an industry this truly was. And I think that in a lot of ways, they frequently say that you're waiting for the law to catch up. And so in immigration, in a lot of areas, that's very true. I mean, for example, if you're going for an extraordinary ability green card, one of the categories is commercial success. And they list the ways in which you can prove that, which include sales of compact discs and cassette tapes. And, you know, I don't have to say that this is no longer how music is, you know, spread around, but usually you can argue this is comparable evidence. You know, this is akin, you know, viewership on YouTube or Twitch is akin to someone selling 1 million records. But that's the type of thing that you have to do with immigration, which is just inform them, educate them, and provide a lot of supplemental information about what this industry truly is, because they may know the immigration regulations, but they don't necessarily know, you know, every industry that's out there or every person. I mean, I'm doing, you know, some actors from foreign countries who people from that country would be like, oh my gosh, you're emailing with that person? And I have no idea who they are personally, but they're super famous in their own country. So it's just, you know, number one is about educating immigration. And I would say that the sort of 3 biggest visa categories for esports would be O, P, and I. And I'll start with I just because it's the shortest, and that's for a media representative. And I've done these for commentators because you have these massive esports competitions at like the Staples Center. Not now, obviously, but they did exist. And there's, you know, play-by-play color commentary on the sideline, just as there would be for the NBA or the NFL. And if those, you know, people are coming from a foreign media company to come report on this competition, they can get an I visa. And you just have to be able to, again, educate them about why this falls under that category of media representative, because what they're used, or, you know, documentary filmmaker, what they're used to is someone from the BBC being shipped to Washington, D.C. to cover the U.S. Election. So they're, you know, immigration in a lot of ways is very narrowly focused and very traditional, and you just have to, you know, the internet didn't even exist when most of these regulations were created. So there's just no language in there about specific things like, you know, YouTube viewership. So it's really important to educate. And one of the ways in which we as an immigration attorney community have done so is finally sort of cross the threshold of really being able to show that an esports athlete is an athlete as described in the regulations. So, for example, a P1A is a athlete visa category, and that's the same thing that, you know, someone from a foreign country coming to play in the NBA would get. So you know, immigration for the longest time was like, okay, we got this. This is soccer, basketball, all of these traditional sports. And then you have someone, they're playing a video game. How is that athletic, or how is that an athlete? And we've sort of crossed the threshold now where they're understanding that, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to explain it on every single petition. The thing about a P is that it's pretty narrow in terms of what you can do here in the US. It's really competition based and, you know, season based. You have to show what you're coming here to do. And if you can't show more than one season, perhaps, then you can only really get that visa for the amount of time that you need to compete here in the US. And it's very difficult to do sort of anything else on the P, which is really hard in this context because a lot of these esports personalities and players aren't just traditional players. They're also sponsored. So if you're on a P visa and you're coming here and you're doing, you know, you're sponsored by Gatorade and you're doing a commercial here, that's not really covered under the P. That's outside the scope. So it's very important to know at the outset, what are you coming here to do in the US? And a lot of the reason people go with the P instead of the O, which I'll get to next, is that it's a lower threshold. You don't have to be quote unquote extraordinary for a P visa. You do have to be internationally recognized in more than one country. So as long as you have an article in at least 2 countries, you have a chance. But it is important, obviously, to know what you're coming to do. And the O is the extraordinary ability in athletics. And that is a much broader type of visa. And it would allow you, assuming you have agreements or deal memos or letters of intent for a variety of projects that require someone of your level to do, you can put into the itinerary more than just compete at the League of Legends finals at the Staples Center. You can do these photo shoots, you can do these other types of things. You can have an agent apply for you based, on behalf of several different companies so that you can do everything. I mean, I did a visa probably about a year or 2 ago for a streamer gamer who was coming here to play a role in a huge feature film that has yet to come out because no movies are coming out anymore. But he was playing a gamer, not himself, but playing a gamer in this gaming themed film. And for fans of the gaming industry or esports, it's going to be like exciting for them to see this film and catch all these little Easter eggs of famous people for them. So, you were saying about who people know and what they sort of, the age thing and who knows what's like. If I asked my 8-year-old niece, do you know who Brad Pitt is? She would say no. If I asked her who, Ninja is, she'd be like, oh yeah, totally. It's a total discrepancy in age. I mean, I have a 23-year-old sister and I'll come home and say, what are you watching? And she's like, oh, just YouTube stuff. And I'm like, you haven't watched like The Wire yet? Like, it's a disconnect that we really need to come together for. And so the O is a much tougher category, certainly now, but it's a much more broad, it's a better visa because a lot of these influencers, there's a lot of 360 type representation for them. So they're getting pitched in all of these different revenue streams. And to be able to do that sort of legally in the US, you have to have authorization for all of it. And, there's a very slim way in which you can come to the US as a visitor and compete, but the only thing you're allowed to compete for is prize money. And at the end of the day, most competitions these days aren't solely about prize money because you can get signed and then you can get, you're locked into representing this car company because that car company is affiliated with the competition, and all of that stuff sort of throws that out the window. And to go sort of deeper into the actual process, once you file an P or an O, and if it's approved, you then have to get a visa stamp, unless you're Canadian. They're the only people who don't. And before you go to your interview at a U.S. consulate abroad, you have to fill out a form online. And you have to now, as of, I believe it was June 2019, have to list all of your social media handles on this form. So they're looking at what it is you do, who you are. And you might think to yourself, I'm a photographer, I'm a British photographer, I'm shooting for British Vogue, I'm being paid by British Vogue to my British bank account, but the shoot's in Malibu. So it should be fine, right? I'm only going for a day. The answer is no, it's not. It's about where you do the work. It's not necessarily the revenue source, but if you're coming to the US and you're working in your capacity in your profession, you're working in the US and you need a work visa. And it's never been easier to tell than it is now, when you have someone can pull up your phone or your social media account and see you very clearly in New York City filming, a 10-second video for some sponsor that you have with a hashtag ad. And, maybe they're paying you abroad. Maybe you were there for something else and you just happened to do it. But with how visible everything is now, it is very important to abide by all the sort of regulations, because you can get caught a lot easier now that we have this lovely internet and social media and everybody's promoting themselves. And, I have to have conversations with clients that say, you can't do this, or, clean up this, it's tricky these days.
And Jackie, speaking of all those regulations, just a quick question. Any thoughts as to if we do have a new president and administration in place, how would a different immigration philosophy perhaps affect esports immigration, if at all? Or does it matter what administration's in charge?
I would say, generally speaking, this administration has obviously, if you opened a computer or a newspaper in the last 3 years, been very strict on immigration, sort of across the board. If we get a new president, I assume that some of the sort of policies or directives that were put into place under this administration will hopefully sort of rescind, and things will go back to how they were, pre this administration, in terms of being able to have a better idea of when you file something that it's going to be approved, that there's not going to be sort of ridiculous questions asked of you. But it's not something that would happen overnight, and it's not something that's specific to esports by any means. I think that if you put together a comprehensive petition, which includes, just general, for something like an influencer, I would pull articles that clearly say influencers are the new advertising experts. And then you put those all together and you quote them in your petition, and you talk about how this is the new way to do things in this industry. So I don't know that it will happen overnight, but we can hope, I guess. But, not only has this administration sort of slowed things down a bit for immigration, generally speaking, but obviously with COVID-19, there have been a lot of changes to immigration. I mean, consulates abroad were closed for 4 or 5 months. Only now are starting to slowly resume some services. So people have been stuck outside the U.S., not able to come when they needed to come. There's travel restrictions in place. There's, it's a lot. And it takes a lot of time from the start of a case to getting someone in the U.S. Not always, but if you have you look at your next year, if you have a competition 6 months from now, it's like, let's get started on the visa now instead of waiting, 3 weeks before. I've done visas where the lead actor in a film is replaced 2 weeks before shooting, and it's a scramble to try to get him here. So the more time you can provide, the better.
Well, thank you. I guess that's one of the great virtues of esports, is that it can be done that it can be done virtually, and that doesn't have to be a live event. And certainly that's one of the things that Andy was talking about in the very beginning about the effect of COVID-19 on the industry. I think that approaches our hour, and so really wanted to thank everybody for listening. Hope everybody found it insightful, enjoyable, and interesting. And stay tuned for some of our other webinars on the topic of esports, and really wanted to thank Andy and Jackie for their thoughts and insights today. So thanks, everybody.